L'État détient le monopole de l'usage légitime de la violence. Max Weber.
On est dans un jeu de juste mesure entre la violence et la légitimité de l'usage de cette violence.
Qu'est-ce qui se passe quand l'un des protagonistes ne respecte plus son deal? Est-ce qu'il a toujours le droit d'exercer cette violence?
Cette violence, on la connaît, on est né avec. On a banalisé la violence.
Nous servons la République. Est-ce qu'on vous laisse casser? Est-ce qu'on vous laisse saccager?
Et moi, la question que je me pose, quel ordre protège les forces de l'ordre?
Ne parlez pas de répression ou de violence policière, ces mots sont inacceptables dans un état de droit.
La question des violences policières, elle acquis une centralité dans les quartiers populaires qui ont servi de laboratoire.
Voilà une classe qui se tient.
Qui a la légitimité statutaire de dire « vous êtes violent ».
Mais mon Dieu, il y a des jeunes enfants, mais sérieusement!
Rien n'est caché, ce qui se passe est maintenant révélé à la face du monde par des vidéos qui sont amplifiées.
Est-ce que c'est normal ça?
What is a government? How would you define a state? Something we all do together? Okay, that could just be a community group or a sports team. Something we all do together that helps people, that we all contribute to? It could just be a food bank. What makes a state, a government, particular? What is it about a government that is specific to the function of governing, that no other thing can claim? Not a business, not an NGO, nothing. A way that groups of humans represent themselves to one another? Okay, but again, that could be almost any group of human beings, including, well, a sports team, again. Let me know how this definition lands in your brains. How about a government is the only entity that has a legitimate right to hurt you? Part 1, a monopoly on legitimate violence. First of all, what does legitimate mean? It basically means that everyone regards that thing, a legitimate thing, as proper for someone to have done, and importantly, as something that they will agree to go along with. So something is legitimate if we agree that it's proper for the person to have done it, and we're basically going to go along with it. Different things can be legitimate in different contexts. Asking someone to get a driver's license before they get on the highway, for example. But we also regard things as not legitimate. The police knocking down your door without a warrant, for example, or a distant government taxing you without giving you adequate representation in that government. But how do we really know the difference between legitimate and illegitimate acts? Is it just a matter of opinion? Often people disagree about what is actually legitimate. Is it legitimate for the state to require vaccination against a deadly communicable disease before they board an airplane, visit someone in a hospital, attend in-person classes in high school or college? One person's legitimate demand is another person's illegitimate demand. What about each of those same scenarios, but for carrying a gun, or for staging a protest, for wearing a political slogan on your t-shirt?
If you start building a military premised on the use of private contractors, you are privatizing something that is what essentially sets a nation state apart, which is the monopoly on violence.
Max Weber, German sociologist, born 1864, just before the end of the American Civil War, died in 1920, just after the end of World War I, said that there are 3 sources of legitimacy for governments. 3 things that make everyone believe that what you're saying is basically justified and we're going to go along with it. These sources are custom, charisma, and legality. You can think of custom as the eternal past, following what your ancestors did. It's always been this way, this is how we do it because this is the best way. Now straighten up and do it how we've always done it. That is custom. Number 2 is charisma. When the personal authority of someone is so overwhelming, people cannot help but follow it. Great leaders who seem to sweep people up in their wake. People who are in the same room with them feel like they're the only person in the room when they talk to them. These are the great demagogues and leaders of history. Number 3, legality. This is a system of rules that apply to everyone more or less equally. And again, this is kind of a novel idea in human history. The idea that you have a neutral set of rules, everyone follows them. Rich and famous people get parking tickets just like everyone else. For Weber, the best possible leader is one who combines charisma with legality, with reason. But it's hard to combine those for most people. If everyone is swept along by the power of your speech, by what you're saying, why bother with rules? And why especially bother with rules that apply to everyone equally, including to you? You're the charismatic leader. Should you really not be allowed to park your sports car on the sidewalk? The fact that it's hard for most people to combine charismatic appeal with rational, legalistic, rule-bound systems is really dangerous. And it's dangerous because politicians control the only means of legitimate violence within a society. The government can legitimately hurt you. No other entity can. With the possible and interesting exception of your parents, but we'll leave that for another class in another department. This is Weber's most famous line. It's his definition of what a government is. He says a government is an entity that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. It's the only thing that we all agree can actually hurt people. And we will basically regard that hurting as okay, as legitimate, as a necessary evil, if even an evil at all. You see this mostly in the forms of armies and police. So if you disobey the law somehow, anything from killing someone to not paying a traffic ticket, eventually someone will show up at your door with a gun and they'll make you come with them in shackles if need be, and they'll hurt you or they'll put you in a cage. And a judge will approve the whole process with the stamp of legitimacy that the whole people give him, including you. Remember, for Rousseau, you're part of the general will here. There's a reason that criminal cases are the defendant versus the people of the state of. We regard this violence as legitimate, as a necessary part of keeping a society together. You can also see this in the form of war. War is basically just the government convincing a bunch of young kids to go kill a bunch of other young kids for a political reason. That would be crazy if a corporation or a hospital did it, but it's totally legitimate when a government does it. Again, this is because government has a monopoly, they're the only ones who can do it, a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. This is Weber's great insight into what a government is and how it functions. Getting back to Weber's three sources of authority: custom, charisma, and rational legality. He says that each can fail in its own particular way. Now, some of these are obvious. In the case of custom, you can simply become rule-bound to the way things were done before, and it limits your ability to grow and change, and can also be quite unfair. In the case of charisma, well, the atrocities committed by charismatic leaders are as long as history itself. But Weber is very interested in the failure cases for legal, rational administration of a state, the failure cases for a rule-bound system. How can that fail? Well, Weber says modern states that use this rational legal authority are dominated by the application of instrumental rationality to everything. By instrumental rationality, Weber just means how to do things better in a technical sense, but not an ethical sense. So, you can run a terrorist operation in an instrumentally rational way, but it would not be very ethical because you're killing a bunch of people. But you could also run a hospital or a school in an instrumentally rational way, and it would be ethical because you're helping people. Weber says that modern states prize instrumental rationality, and bureaucracy is a natural outgrowth of the prioritization of the rational administration of a rule-bound system. This is just something you kind of need to have if you're going to run a rules-based system. And bureaucracies are messy, and they also require hierarchies. There always has to be a person behind a desk one level higher than you that you can take the papers to be signed. Anyone who's dealt with the Cooney administration knows that this is true. This can be a problem because it engenders docility and servility from the people who have to constantly appeal to people who sit behind powerful, important desks. Each bureaucrat tends to be limited to a specific function, which engenders specialization and limited silos of knowledge rather than holistic knowledge. This also means that bureaucracies are very hard to displace, especially for elected officials who might go in and out of office every 4 to 10 years. But a bureaucrat, a lifetime bureaucrat, has an immense body of specialized knowledge that no one else really knows. It might literally be true that no one else can do the bureaucrat's job without another 3 years of training. These are some reasons that Weber worries about legal or rational domination via bureaucracy. Remember, he's writing right around the turn of the century, the early 1900s. And so this is really the rise of the bureaucratic, rule-bound state. Bureaucracies, whatever their flaws, are unavoidable because they remain the most effective way we have yet discovered of organizing large amounts of human beings and material to accomplish a big goal. This is essential for any modern government system. This constitutes a pervasive and unavoidable historical trend toward rationalization and bureaucratization. Weber says that this trend will one day even trump capitalism itself. He warns of a world where our most sublime values have been trumped and frozen in a world of rigid bureaucratic rationality. He says we're headed for a polar night of icy darkness. What's the escape then? What do we do? Well, Weber says you can elect bureaucrats, for one. If the bureaucrats are the ones who are going to eventually have all the power, make it an official elected position, the way a politician is elected. This invites the question, though, of wouldn't you just eventually arrive back at the same problem where you're electing bureaucrats, but then there are the real specialized bureaucrats, the unelected people who actually know how things run, and then you've arrived back at the original problem. Weber also floats the idea of plebiscites, or referendums, in which people vote directly on whether or not an idea is good. This form of direct democracy, he thinks, can act as an effective check on bureaucracies in some circumstances. He also says that that other great source of authority, charisma, can be used to fight bureaucratization. Elect a charismatic leader who can sweep away or push back the tides of bureaucratization. But this, of course, carries its own risks. If we fail, Weber says, we will experience a dictatorship of little people functioning as little cogs in a big machine, a polar night of icy darkness. Part 2, After God. Max Weber is the first person we're reading who exists in a post-Nietzsche world. That is, a world where God is recognized as no longer central in political and civic life. A world where both science and religion have been decanted of their promise to help secure happiness and truth. In part because of this, Weber has a very contemporary, nuanced view of politics and government. He says that groups and cultures create meaning by struggling against one another in a conflict of subjective viewpoints. Most things have multiple causes and multiple meanings. This is a big departure from a lot of the ancient and early modern political philosophers who come before him. Weber says it's more complicated than that, especially in contemporary societies. Everything has many, many causes and many, many potential solutions. The role of political science for Weber is of helping us make decisions between those different viewpoints which are struggling against one another. Social science, Weber says, can offer enough guidance to discredit some of the obviously false values, and it can also point to obvious results of action based on other value judgments. It can get the obvious stuff right, Weber thinks. This is why he thinks social science is so important. It helps us navigate values in a chaotic and plural world. The role of an instructor in social science, Weber says, is for the instructor to occasionally teach the students inconvenient facts with respect to their own party affiliations. Maybe I've done that here, I don't know. If Nietzsche represents in culture and philosophy the transition away from the Enlightenment into the mysterious thing that comes next that we're currently living in, then Weber signals that same transition from modernity to postmodernity in political science. He's starting to usher in analyses that are more grounded in empirical observations of institutions and government functions, which will become hallmarks of political science in the 20th and 21st centuries. But for that, we'll have to wait for another semester, another class, another life, as this is pretty much where we have to leave the story of modern political thought and of Politics 227. At the cusp of the 20th century, staring down the barrel of 2 world wars, multiple pandemics, and a whole lot of other things no one knows are coming. Part 3. The end of Politics 227. To wrap up the course, I'm going to go through a quick recap of everyone we've looked at and put them in a big timeline and also rank them on a tier list. The real study guide for the final is actually just the syllabus. Everything on there is fair game. The exam will focus on the second half, but it is a comprehensive exam. So everything that we've read so far in the course is fair game. And of course, the real study guide is the fact that you have a recorded lecture of every single week of the whole class, accessible at any time, that can be replayed infinitely many times at whatever speed you want. Simply click through to the playlist for this course, which I've linked in past emails and also appears at the end of most of the videos, for a handy list of every lecture that we've done so far. Okay, ranking everyone that we've read. First up, Niccolò Machiavelli. Circa 1530s, The Prince comes out in 1532. I would put Machiavelli is either S or A tier. He's kind of like the original, let's go with, you know what? Let's go with very high A tier for Machiavelli, very high A. We'll say that. This is kind of a mix of like my personal enjoyment and also like overall like importance as a political theorist. Machiavelli, high A tier. Thomas Hobbes, 1650s. Machiavelli kind of signals the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the modern period in philosophy. He's an early modern. Thomas Hobbes, 1650s. Leviathan comes out in 1651. Obviously super important. He's another, like, do you put him in the S or the A tier type figure? like Machiavelli. I think he's like a really high A or a really low S. Let's put him in a high A tier. Hobbes. John Locke. John Locke, right after Hobbes, 2 treatises on government, comes out in 1689. So we're talking 1680s now, we're moving up. I mean, hard to keep Locke out of the, to keep him, I only picked winners for this still. There's gonna be a lot of high scores. I mean, Locke's pound for pound, I think Locke is S tier. I think he's S. Not that fun to read, but I mean, importance, he's basically just like straight up quoted in the Declaration of Independence and in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and everything that follows. Like, the guy is just too important to keep out of the S tier. So Locke is S tier. Congratulations, John. Okay, next, Edmund Burke. Reflections on the Revolution in France comes out during the Revolution in France. So 1790s. We're up to the 1790s now. Burke, to me, he's like a B or a C tier, I think. He's pretty enjoyable to read at times. Not quite as important as Hobbes, Machiavelli, or Locke. Put him in the B tier. B for Burke. Okay, next up, Jeremy Bentham. The boy Bentham. Bentham is a nice guy. Panopticon's a cool idea, but he does not have the impact of the other guys on the list. I think he's a C tier. He's a C tier guy. Definitely not at a D or an F, but. Next up, we're getting Immanuel Kant. This is roughly a contemporary of Burke and Locke. His stuff is coming out in the 1780s. What is Enlightenment, for example, is 1784. Kant is pretty awesome, actually. We don't even read the heavy hitters for Kant in this. If this were like a metaphysics, history of European philosophy class, Kant would be S tier, without a doubt. But it's a political philosophy class. He's A tier. He's A tier. Right, he's a little below Hobbes and Machiavelli. There's a lot of competition there at the top. Okay, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau comes along actually a little earlier in our timeline. The Social Contract comes out in 1762. I know that is slightly out of order. Rousseau is really famous. You probably gotta put him in the A tier, I think. You just kind of have to. I think he's probably below Machiavelli. He's going in the A tier. Hegel. Hegel's another one who, like Kant and like the other German idealists, he is more of a heavy hitter outside of political philosophy and regular philosophy, but he's still really important. I think in regular philosophy, he'd be A or S tier, probably just a touch below Kant. In this class, I feel like philosophy of right. I don't know, he's so hard to read, and idealism is mostly gets used as a counterpoint to Marx. So I honestly, this might make people mad, but I'm put Hegel in the B tier. I think Hegel is very high B, very low A. Put Hegel in the B tier with Burke. Hegel is mostly active in the early 1800s. Phenomenology of Spirit, for example, comes out in 1807. So now we've made the transition to the 1800s. We've jumped the gap, and dominating the second half of the 1800s, active from the 1840s all the way through the 1880s, is Karl Marx and his buddy Engels, but we're mostly ranking Marx here. Hard to beat Marx. He's so important. He really has great style. He was like a romantic poet before he wrote all the political stuff, which his work has had an incredible impact in a way that no one had since Locke. Are up there as the two people who people have literally written into the constitutions word for word of their countries. Marx he's got to be S tier, up there with Locke. For importance, for readability, for impact, for just being really interesting, for saying that philosophy heretofore has tried to understand the world, the point is to change it. What a mission statement for a philosopher to just sit down and write that. Marx is S tier. Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is simultaneously, okay, it's tempting to put Nietzsche really high, like A or S, but I think Nietzsche would hate that. I think Nietzsche would hate tier lists. He'd be like, the weak and servile, pitiless tier list. Nietzsche is F tier, only because Nietzsche would really like being put in the F tier. And of course, Nietzsche is active in the final few decades of the 1800s. He dies in 1900 on the dot, which is incredibly convenient for intellectual historians who are dividing between the modern period, and then whatever comes after modernity, the contemporary period, the postmodern period, whatever you want to call it. And Nietzsche is like, he's like both S and F tier at the same time. And then finally, Max Weber. Max Weber, as you know, is active in the first few years of the 1900s. He's an actual 20th century sociologist and political scientist. Weber's awesome. He doesn't have the heavy-hitting power of the other people that we've really read in this course. I personally really like him, though. I like reading Weber a lot in undergrad. I took a class exactly like this. It was like Nietzsche to the contemporary period, and Weber was a huge part of it. And because he's so contemporary, he's so focused on what actually matters, like the empirical situation. He's so practical to modern ears that I love Weber. I mean, as a philosophical headliner, he's somewhere in like the Bentham Burke range, but as someone that I really like, he's like an A tier. So we're gonna compromise and we're gonna put him in the B tier with Hegel and Burke. Okay, there's your tier list. Modern political philosophy, 1500 to 1900. To find out what comes next, you'll have to take the sequel to this course, Contemporary Political Thought, 1900 to the present. Until next time.
Fly me to the moon and let me play among the stars. Let me see what spring is like on